after.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Asia Clark, the first floor manager here at the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, Washington, D.C.'s first memorial to Dr. King. Welcome to today's virtual program with Karen Gray Houston, author of Daughter of the Boycott, Carrying on a Montgomery Family's Civil Rights Legacy. In 1972, the MLK Library opened its doors as the new Central Branch location of the DC Public Library System, welcoming visitors to explore, research, and engage with authors, artists, and activists. 50 years later, and with our recent modernization, we continue to reflect the best and brightest of Washington, D.C. as a place of learning and understanding for all residents. We invite you to explore our reading rooms, the interactive labs, our special exhibitions, and the new rooftop garden as MLK Library celebrates 50 remarkable years. As part of our celebration, we are delighted to kick it off this week in conversation with two exceptional storytellers, Karen Gray Houston and Paula Young Shelton. As a reporter for Fox 5, NBC News, ABC, and WTOP, Karen has been telling our stories for more than 4 decades. We are thrilled you have brought your story of your remarkable family and their fight for civil rights here to Washington, D.C. Welcome home. An educator and renowned children's author, Paula Young Shelton, is no stranger to Washington or D.C. Public Library. When she's not teaching our next generation of readers at Georgetown Day School, you can find her books for children and families in local bookstores and here at DC Public Library, including her latest, Child of the Civil Rights Movement. Thank you, Paula, for leading tonight's conversation. And a special thank you, to our friends at Loyalty Books, where you can purchase Daughter of the Boycott online using the link in the YouTube description below. Thank you, Hannah Oliver Depp, owner of Loyalty Books. For audiences watching on YouTube, submit your questions in the comments section and we'll share them during the program. Thank you. And take it away, Paula and Karen.
All right. Thank you so much, Asia, for that wonderful introduction. It is indeed a pleasure to be back at the Martin Luther King Library, even if it is virtually. I have had the pleasure of sharing my book here at the library and just always enjoy the programs that are taking place there at the Martin Luther King Jr. Library. And I cannot wait for you to reopen so I can get back in there. It is especially great to be here with Karen. Karen and I have had the pleasure of sharing our books together and talking about the civil rights movement in previous events. And it is always good to sit and talk with Karen and hear her story, her fascinating story, and more about her book, Daughter of the Movement.
Hey, Paula, it was last year, I think. Yeah. Black History Month. Your school hosted us, Georgetown Day School. And so, we've had this online virtual relationship. I can't wait to kind of actually eyeball you and see face to face. We're going to do that at some point.
Yes, we will have to come together in person. It's really great to be here to talk about Martin Luther King's legacy and to be here during January in the week of his birth, when we celebrate his birth, and to come together and really talk about what Dr. King meant to us all and also, how we are carrying on his legacy. And being here with Karen to talk about Dr. King and really, because since both of us had the opportunity to participate in the civil rights movement, although we were babies at the time, right, Karen?
Please, let's remind the people we're not that old. But I was 4 years old during the Montgomery bus boycott. So that was, I'm not going to say the year out loud.
Well, but you know,
But we
I
were
mean,
children.
it brings to mind that this is not ancient history that we're talking about. When we talk about segregation and discrimination and the types of laws that existed in our country that separated people based on race, you know, this was not so long ago. And I think that's really important to remember.
It wasn't so long ago, and we're at a point where there have been what, like 3 generations of people who know nothing about hardcore segregation. And what was it? Black people could not go to white restaurants or
Right.
schools, or they set aside water fountains for white people and colored people. And if you wanted to ride on a bus, you could ride with the white people, but you had to sit in the back of the bus. A lot of people have not had that personal experience. And so my book is really just a kind of a reminder that, well, we've made some progress, but wow, do you remember that? No.
Right, right. And I think the other important thing about your book, Karen, is that, you know, your father and your uncle were very much involved and had a tremendous impact on the civil rights movement. And I think it's important to remember that Dr. King did not change the course of history by himself, that there were amazing people like your father and your uncle who were there as foot soldiers who really made things happen. And that's important for us to understand, that this was not a movement of one person, but that it took all of us coming together and each of us fighting our battles in order to really accomplish the progress that we made so far.
Right. For me, it was a family story that I'm telling, and the whole bus boycott was about family, and it was about community. A lot of people came together and made sacrifices and really put their lives on pause and subjected themselves to possible violence. You know, bombings of churches and people's houses and things like that. The reason I wrote Daughter of the Boycott was to say thank you to those people,
Mm.
to say thank you to my father, the late Judge Thomas Gray, to say thank you to, he was a boycott organizer. He was on the board of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which coordinated the day-to-day activities of the boycott. And my uncle Fred was the renowned civil rights attorney, he was the boycott attorney. And we're looking at pictures now of my family. Let me just take you back to the 1950s.
Yes, tell us a little bit
in
about
Montgomery.
it.
And the pictures you're seeing, that's me and my 2 younger brothers, Thomas Jr. and Frederick, my mother, Juanita Gray, and my dad, Thomas Gray. Well, they were college sweethearts at Alabama State. Teachers College for Negroes is what the college was called then. It's now Alabama State University.
Right, exactly.
So they met and married and had a family, and we moved they moved to a little neighborhood called Mobile Heights, which was really set up for veterans, Black veterans who had come back from serving in World War II and the Korean War, and they needed housing and places to stay, and they used their GI loans, the GI Bill, to get their housing. So we moved into a little neighborhood, and it was very nice there, but it was segregated like everything else. Montgomery was like the South, totally segregated. It was Black and white. You couldn't go to Black. You couldn't go to the white restaurants and, all those places, schools and all that. My parents tried to sort of protect us from a lot of that repulsiveness as much as they could. But what was happening in Montgomery at the time was the one place that people couldn't avoid. I mean, they could patronize Black restaurants and they could patronize Black churches and go to Black schools, but they had to get to work. They had to get around. It was at a time when people didn't have a lot of cars. And so they had to ride the buses, and they were offended at the way they were treated on the buses. You'd get on and you had to sit in the back. often, if it was crowded, you had to pay your little dime fare, get off the front, go around to the side, and sit in the back. And the 10 seats in the front of the bus were reserved for white people, whether they were on the bus or not. So it was, it was a horrible time. I remember as a child, even though my parents tried to protect us from some of that stuff, that we had to deal with it. And for example, my mom came from Shreveport, Louisiana, so we would visit her relatives and her mom and everybody in the summer. And sometimes we would take the train, and we would have to sit in the black car. And my dad would usually take us at a time so we wouldn't have to go into the waiting room and sit in the colored waiting room. We'd go at the last minute and get on the train and sit in the black car. And sometimes we took a car. We would drive. And after Emmett Till was lynched in nearby Mississippi, he made it a point to drive us early, get on the road early in the morning, so we would cross through Mississippi during the light of day. So those are the kinds of things that I really remember from that period of time when I was, only 4 years old.
So can you tell me a little bit about, maybe we can go back to the pictures before, or there you are with your father and your uncle.
Right. My dad, this is a picture of Thomas Gray, which hangs on a wall at his alma mater, Alabama State University. I think that's in the administration offices. And it says, "I was there." I give Alabama State credit for trying to keep the story of the Montgomery bus boycott alive. And they do incredible programs every year on the anniversary. And when they were celebrating the 60th anniversary, they put some pictures of people who were actually there on the walls. And so there's my dad. And this other picture in the middle is of me with my Uncle Fred. I call him Uncle Teddy. Back when he was a student at Alabama State, his friends called him Teddy. I don't know why, but anyway, when I was born and my brothers, my dad called him Teddy. And so we called him Uncle Teddy. And I call him Uncle Teddy to this day. And a lot of my friends still call him Uncle Teddy. He allowed me, when I was working on the book, I needed information. And so I had already interviewed my dad on camera. My younger brother, Thomas Jr., had decided at some point, hey, Dad knows so much about the boycott that he never really told us. Let's sit him down in front of a camera and let him tell us some stories. And he told us all these stories we'd never heard about. I did the same thing with my uncle. And he also allowed me, while I was doing my book research, to just tag along with him on his journeys. He had speaking engagements around the country, and I would just go with him to listen to what he had to say. People want to know what he has to say about the Montgomery bus boycott, and the rest of his incredible career as a civil rights attorney. He has done cases that have landmark cases that have gone to the U.S. Supreme Court. Some of which he has argued, and they are being taught in law schools around the country to this day. And I think this was at the University of South Carolina, where I tagged along with him and my Aunt Carol just to see what he was going to say there. And here's one thing, Paula, really, that I noticed. Every single time I go and listen to him speak, he tells a story I have never heard before. And just as a credit to what he is and what he's done, there is a historical marker on Dexter Avenue, which is the main street in downtown Montgomery on the right there. There's a historical marker that tells his whole story. And he was also, the first Black state representative in Alabama since Reconstruction. So he's had a marvelous career.
Wow. They both sound like remarkable men. And I know that they did some tremendous things during the civil rights movement. And, you talk a lot about the Montgomery bus boycott, and that was obviously, a kickoff point for this modern civil rights movement. But I was surprised to see that in your book, that's not where you start, that you started with a gentleman named Hilliard Brooks. And I have to admit, I was not familiar with him before reading your book. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and what made you start there, and what's the connection to the boycott?
this was, let me just say, Hilliard Brooks, that incident set the stage for the boycott. It was 5 years before the boycott, 1950. And Hilliard Brooks he was actually a friend of my dad's. They had played street football as kids. Both had gone to the military, both served in the Navy. And in 1950, my dad was teaching at St. Jude Educational Institute. It's a Black private Catholic school in Montgomery. And he and my mother were both teaching night school. Hilliard Brooks was taking classes there. There was an American Veterans Incorporated unit, AMVETS, and they were training vets and helping the vets who didn't have, high school degrees. And Hilliard Brooks was shot and killed by a white police officer in an incident involving a bus ride. He was trying to get a ride on a bus in downtown Montgomery. And there was, you hate to say it, he was drunk and disorderly, and everybody acknowledges that. And bus driver called over a police officer, and he was shot and killed. I'm going to read something to you from my book where I talk about.
Excellent. Yeah.
I talk about Hilliard. Okay. The incident occurred August 12th, 1950. Nobody doubted that Hilliard Brooks was inebriated. Witnesses agree he was unruly when he tried to board a bus on Dexter Avenue, but there are several versions of what happened next. One was that Brooks was shot when he got off the bus after exchanging words with the white driver for refusing to put his dime bus fare in. Another has it that Brooks had been drinking and dropped his money on the floor. When the bus driver told him to pick it up, Brooks says, "You pick it up." But whatever happened, the bus driver summoned a nearby police officer to deal with a disturbing the peace complaint. Brooks must have gotten off the bus. As historian J. Mills Thornton tells the story, police officer Emmy Mills pushed Brooks to the sidewalk and shot him to death after he struggled back to his feet. According to at least one account, Brooks was coming toward the officer, but other witnesses reported Brooks was standing with his arms at his side. And I don't want to read too much more. I'm going to read one more paragraph of this so we can talk about it a little. An article in the newspaper the day after the shooting said Brooks was drunk and cursing. The advertiser said there were hundreds of witnesses. Some of them called the shooting reckless and needless. The newspaper quotes a detective as saying the bullet went through Brooks' stomach and injured two bystanders. A man and a woman were struck in the leg. According to the advertiser, Officer Emmy Mills said Brooks hit at him and pulled the whistle and chain from his shirt. The officer pushed Brooks away. That's when he fell, got up, and allegedly advanced towards the policeman. The officer shot him, and Brooks later died in the hospital. What does that sound like? Like we've been there before?
Too many stories that we have heard that a Black man is somewhere people think he should not be, or doing something they think he should not be doing, but at no point was his behavior worth being murdered. I mean, that is the thing that is just so outrageous.
It really is. And what's the common denominator in all these cases, in the George Floyd case, or the Michael Brown, or Breonna Taylor, or Eric Gaynor, or I can't even keep up. There's a recent one, Jason Walker in Fayetteville. We don't even really know what happened there, but often the circumstances are murky. Details are kind of murky, but where does it say that the police officer gets to be the judge, jury, and executioner? And so that's, the common denominator is a lack of regard for Black life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
How do we change it? This was more than 70 years ago, and it's still happening.
Right. Well, that is the very discouraging part, is we feel like we've made so much progress, and we have. There have been a lot of positive changes. But then you see this happening and you realize in some ways we have not gone so far. And sometimes it seems like we're going backwards. At
Well,
least those kinds of murders are now getting the attention because a Hilliard Brooks was just, dismissed and barely talked about until recently.
here's some things that you know we ought to consider that nobody really thinks about. You hear about these cases, and it's not just the person who gets killed who's affected by it.
Mm,
What about their families? I recently uh, was in touch with Hilliard Brooks' widow, and she told me, no one has ever really asked her about what happened.
hmm,
She never really knew. She found out because the undertaker, the funeral directors were sometimes the people who went to the scenes of these accidents and picked up the bodies.
right.
That man came to her house, and she was sitting on the front porch, and he said, "A white police officer shot your husband, and he's in the hospital." And she went to the hospital. And when she got to the hospital, they told her she needed some money before they were going to really work on him. This is what she tells me. I mean, so she and the doctor said, "Oh, it's a really bad injury. If you have children, you should bring them back with you."
Mm,
And her husband died before she could get back to the hospital. But in all of these cases, I mean, it affects an entire family. You
right.
know, leaving wives and children behind. It's just
The
horrible.
community.
Correct.
Exactly. Yeah. So this was about 5 years before the Montgomery bus boycott.
And so I think by the time Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person, um, this was something that was in the back of people's minds. They were thinking about that. And there were some more things that people don't know. I mean, let's see, where do we even begin with Rosa Parks? Let's talk about Rosa Parks and Fred Gray. Rosa
Oh,
Parks, okay. Rosa Parks, and here's what we're starting to disentangle the whole myth. Rosa Parks was not the sweet little old quiet lady, subdued seamstress sitting on the bus tired that day. Rosa
well,
Parks,
so,
Rosa
so
Parks was a
often,
warrior. Rosa
right.
Parks was an activist, and she had been an activist since the 40s. She was a secretary for the NAACP. She was working with E.D. Nixon. E.D. Nixon, who was the most influential Black leader in Montgomery at the time. At a time when working at the NAACP was like you were working for the Communist Party. I mean, they were considered a radical organization. She was the chair of the NAACP's Youth Council. But back in the 40s, she was an investigator for the NAACP. They sent her down to Abbeville, Alabama, when a Black woman named Reese Taylor had been raped by 6 white men.
Yeah.
And so, Rosa Parks married an activist. Raymond Parks was a guy who was involved with trying to free the Scottsboro Nine, these young Black kids who were accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train back in the day. So, I mean, Rosa Parks was not the person that that some people read about in history books. I don't remember reading anything about Rosa Parks really in history books as I was growing up, because the history books didn't really get written until 30 and 40 years after the fact. I mean, Rosa Parks didn't write her book till my story until the 1990s. My uncle wrote a book, Bus Ride to Justice, but that was in the 90s. Some of those other books that we heard about, Parting the Waters, all those, they didn't come out until 30 and 40 years later. And so people didn't really, and so I guess that explains why they don't really know what really went on, because we're only just starting to find out.
Right. And Rosa Parks is always painted as being sort of passive, and things just sort of happened to her. And, she had courage, but, this was all very spontaneous. It just, one day she just decided, this is the day I'm going to sit here. But you tell a little bit of a different perspective.
Paula, she seized an opportunity that she had been waiting for. She did work at the Montgomery Fair department store in downtown Montgomery, But in after my uncle, and let me throw something in about him. He had gone to a religious boarding school because my grandmother wanted him to be a preacher, and you could be a preacher or a teacher back then. So he was going to be a preacher, and then he went to Alabama State, and he was going to be a teacher. And then he started seeing all this horrendous way that Black people were being treated on the buses. So he made this kind of secret commitment to himself, going to get his degree at Alabama State. He's going to go to law school up north someplace at a school that will accept a Black student, come back to Alabama, pass the bar, and destroy everything segregated he could find. So he was on a mission. Rosa Parks hated segregation with a passion. And I learned a little bit about that from research at the Library of Congress, where they had her papers were available for researchers when I started doing my research. And I just get goosebumps looking at things she had written, journals, she'd been journaling, letters and notes back and forth to friends. And, she just used to talk about how she felt she had been robbed of an education. And, she had some really strong feelings about white supremacy and what needed to be done. So she and Fred Gray were kindred spirits. And they started meeting for lunch in his new office. He came back to Montgomery in 1954 after he graduated. He was a kid who just fell out of law school, and had an office on Monroe Street downtown. And down the street and around the corner was Montgomery Fair department store where Rosa Parks was working. And according to what I had read in some of her papers, she didn't want to have lunch down there because they wouldn't let the Black people eat at the lunch counter with the white people. They ate in this. They had this special area set aside for them, and it was near a bathroom with a door that wouldn't close. So she didn't want to eat there. So she would bring her little brown bag lunch, and she and Fred would talk about what was going on, what she was doing with the youth council. She was trying to encourage them to go down to the library downtown and check books out. And they were telling her, oh, they won't let us check books out because we're Black. They're telling us to go to our neighborhood library and get some books. And she said she and Edie Nixon were just encouraging them to keep at it, right? So it was and she and my uncle were talking about what she would do if she had another bad experience on a bus, because she had had one before. Same bus driver. Got on the bus, crowded bus. She was going to just walk down the aisle and go to the back. And the bus driver told her, no, you can't go through the white people, right, and offend them. So she had to get off the bus, and he told her to go around to the back, to the side and get on in the back. And when she got off the bus, she said, I'm not getting back on that bus. So that was another thing that was on her mind. And she was talking to my uncle about, and she was saying, what should I do if I'm ever in a situation where the bus driver tells me to let a white person sit in my seat? And she was saying, I won't be belligerent, I'll be this. So, for the people who think that the boycott and what they were doing wasn't planned, well, wrong.
She's been thinking about this for a while.
She had, and so had a lot of other people in Montgomery.
Well, you mentioned Alabama State College, and where your mother's alma mater, right? They had a pretty important role in the bus boycott, didn't they?
It wasn't an official college.
Not officially.
Right. But there were a couple of women there who were English professors, Joanne Robinson, Mary Fair Burks, and, kind of radical actually for their time. And, then back when women were just like forging ahead and they were members of a group called the Women's Political Council. And they had decided that, they were probably more radical than some of the men's groups who were looking at what to do about segregation. But they had decided, they had started meeting with city officials and the City Lines bus company and asking for better treatment of Black people on the buses. And so not only
before Rosa Parks sat in.
Correct.
So they're already planning.
they were planning. And I met Martin Luther King's barber while I was in Montgomery. And if you want to know something about what's going on, go to a barber
To the
shop.
barbershop.
Nelson Malden was telling, well, he was a student at Alabama State back then. And he had classes, I think, with both of those women. But he said in Mary Fair Burks's class, she was telling him and some of the other students, they were assigned to go out on the buses and take notes about bad things that were happening, name of the bus and bus number, bus driver. So they were doing that. Some of what they were doing happened after Claudette Colvin was arrested.
Yes, because before Rosa, there was
Claudette. 9 months before Rosa, March 1955, little 15-year-old Claudette Colvin was a civil rights pioneer. She was a smart student. She was going to Booker T. Washington High School. Some kind of reason they were out of school early that day. And they got on a bus, and the bus got crowded. And at some point, the white driver, well, I don't even have to say white driver because all the drivers were white, turns around and says, I'm going to need one of those seats, because a white person wanted to sit down. So, which meant that everybody in the row, your seats on your side and on the other side, because white people had to be in front of the black people. So everybody was going to have to get up and move to the back. And other students got up and moved, but Claudette was like, I'm not moving. So because what was she thinking about? This was March. She had just been through Black History Month in February. And she had a very progressive teacher who was telling them about how horrible conditions were and segregation was bad. And you shouldn't have to go downtown to a store and draw a picture of an outline of your shoe on a brown paper bag so you can't try shoes on, And so when the bus driver said, get up, she refused to get up. And the bus driver said, call the police officer. Police, long story short, police get on the bus and she said, I'm not getting up. And she tells you, I went up to meet Claudette I begged for a long time. And she said, okay, you can come up and interview me. But she was in New York and living in the Bronx in an apartment. And she said, what I told them was I felt like I had Sojourner Truth's hand holding me down on one side and Harriet Tubman holding me down on the other side. And I wasn't going to get up. And she said the police knocked her books off of her lap and picked her up, and they dragged her off the bus. And their story was she was kicking, scratching, and clawing and screaming. And so she was charged with, assault on a police officer, disorderly conduct, and violating city boycott laws. She was my uncle's first civil rights case.
Is that right?
That was it. And however,
well, how did her case impact the desegregation of the buses?
There should have been a boycott connected to her case.
Right. Yeah.
And people like E.D. Nixon, Mr. Civil Rights is what my uncle called him, and others felt that it was a good case until a couple of months later, Claudette turned up pregnant. And they didn't want an unwed pregnant teenager to be the face of the fight against segregation. So she wasn't the only one. There were several other women who had similar experiences and were arrested and charged with violating the civil rights, the segregation laws. Woman Aurelia Browder, Susie McDonald, and Mary Louise Smith, who was another teenager. She was 18 years old, and no boycott around any of them, because the feeling was they're not the right one. That Mary Louise Smith, they said her father was an alcoholic. The family says not true. Aurelia Browder, who's the named plaintiff on the case, Browder versus Gale, that actually went to the Supreme Court and overturned segregated seating. Some people found, I talked to her son, he said, one of her sons, and he was saying, they weren't ready for her. She was too dark skinned and she was too outspoken. So she wasn't the right person. And Susie McDonald was white, bright, looked almost white. Okay, put it bright and looked almost white. And she would get on the buses and sit in the white section and, talk to people. And so none of them were really it was Rosa Parks had the right demeanor. And, if you ask Claudette and some other people, she had straight hair and she was light skinned and she was somebody that the white people would accept. And so that's what happened. But so Rosa Parks' case, she was charged with disorderly conduct and her case was in the local courts. My uncle represented her and, he appealed when she was convicted, but her case was moving through the local courts. And, my uncle felt that if they were really ever going to get somewhere with segregation, they needed to put a case in federal court. And so the Browder versus Gale was a federal court case that moved up through the courts and went to the U.S. Supreme Court, which struck down segregated seating. So really, it was those women who were more responsible for ending the boycott and segregation in Montgomery than Rosa Parks. But, and Claudette, I kind of feels like,
she was the one that started it all.
Rosa Parks stole her thunder, whatever.
Yes. Well, Rosa Parks made a wonderful spokesperson and image for that boycott. And brought us all together to get to this point. And during that boycott, we know that the women got things started and did the organizing and did the initial first day of the boycott. But then out of this emerges Martin Luther King Jr. as a leader.
A reluctant activist.
Mm-hmm.
Martin Luther King came to town to be a minister at the Upper Crust Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And he, I tell some funny stories. You have to read the book about how he, the day before his first sermon, he went to this barber to get his hair cut. So there's some funny stories in there about his tipping habits and how he dealt with restaurants who wanted Black people to go around to the back of the bus. But that's another story.
You've got to read the book.
You got to read the book to find out some funny stuff. King was the reason he worked and was chosen is because he had a skill. I mean, he was such a skilled orator. And he was new in town and he didn't have any enemies.
No baggage yet.
Exactly. So the other year was like, okay, we're going to pick him and not the other people. And he has left such a powerful legacy because he was such a proponent of Gandhi's theory that you had to have peaceful, nonviolent protest, civil disobedience. That was going to work, and it was going to keep Black people. It was going to give them the moral high ground and put the white supremacist on the wrong side of history. My dad liked to tell a story of how early in the boycott, there was a story in the Montgomery Advertiser. They interviewed Martin Luther King. And King had said that, this was definitely going to be a nonviolent protest. And if there was violence, that the Black people were going to turn the other cheek. And so my dad, Dad was on the Montgomery Improvement Association board with King. And he was saying, King, I really admire you. That was really interesting. What a nice ploy. And King said, no, Brother Greg, no ploy. That is how the movement has to be. This has to be a non-violent movement. And so that is probably the most important part of his legacy. That is also a lesson for people today.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, and he remained non-violent even when they bombed his house. Could you read another passage from your book about that?
Let me see. Here we go. Got a chapter on it called King Parsonage Bombing. Early in the evening of January 30th, 1956, when the bomb went off at Dr. King's house, I was probably tucked under the covers in my twin bed next to my brothers, listening to our mother read to us. Like other children of the era, our parents had wrapped us in a protective cocoon, sheltering us from any of the unpleasantness associated with the bus boycott. My father was out working, repairing somebody's TV set on the other side of town. And I can't remember if I told you already, he was a businessman. He and a neighbor had co-owned a radio, TV, and appliance store where Black people could buy their TV sets at a time when TV was new. Anyway, he was probably repairing somebody's TV set on the other side of town. Turns out it was not too far from the King Parsonage on South Jackson Street in the Centennial Hill area, where kind of the upper crust Black people lived. Dad wrote about that night in some of the many papers he had made us put in boxes marked historical. Before he died, when he was very sickly, he had us, put his things away. He talked about it in an interview that we had taped on camera. I heard the explosion, he told us. A veteran of World War II, he knew what bombs sounded like. The situation with the boycott was getting tense, he said. The bus company was losing money. City officials were cracking down on Black people. Who could predict what the White Citizens Council might do? I rushed right over. A crowd had gathered. There were hostile people in the crowd. Some of them were armed. Making my way through the crowd, I noticed the mayor, police commissioner, and a policeman on the porch. Other officers were trying to move people aside, but the people ignored them. Then Martin arrived. He had been at Reverend Abernathy's church, First Baptist, for a mass meeting, a kind of boycott pep rally. The crowd was in an angry mood. Dr. King raced inside to make sure his wife and baby were okay. When he saw they were unharmed, he returned to the porch and addressed the people gathered at his door. Dad said that King spoke about Jesus and loving our white brethren. He advised everybody not to panic and said if anybody had weapons, they should take them home. Only then did the crowd begin an orderly dispersal. I mean, and here's another thing. When I was working on the book, I met some people who lived 3 doors down from King, the Harris family. I interviewed Vera Harris and her daughter, Valda Harris Montgomery. And they talked about what it was like that night. When the bomb hit the porch at King's house, it affected them too. Their house shook and the windows shattered. And, after that, their father, who was kind of a boycott activist, he was Richard Harris. He owned a drugstore downtown where boycott leaders would gather to and meet, but they would stay outside on his property so the police couldn't get them when they were waiting for rides in the carpool. But those were dangerous times. Valda says her father moved her bed to the back of the house after that.
Wow. And then again, you see the impact of this violence on one person, one family, and how it extends to the community throughout. It's interesting you said that his wife and baby were in the house at the time. And I think it is remarkable that someone could maintain their commitment to nonviolence in the midst of that kind of a threat to their family. But I also remember when my father first met Dr. King, because he was very excited to meet him. And, this was after the bus boycott. And so he had gained some national prominence and that sort of thing. And my father was so excited to come and talk to him and hear his ideas and philosophies. And Yolanda King had just been born. And so all he wanted to talk about was Yogi. And my father had just had his first child as well, my sister Andrea. And he said, Dr. King did not want to talk about civil rights or protest or nonviolence. All he wanted to talk about was his baby girl. And so I think I say that just to remind people about his humanity and what a caring and tremendous family man he was. And that, I maintain that so much of what he did was because he cared so much about his family and his children. And I was wondering if you had some stories about Dr. King you'd like to share as you're growing up and your encounters with him, or the stories that you gathered as you were interviewing folks.
When I was 4, I don't have a memory of him. My mom told me that when we had, that were birthday parties, and that, I guess the King baby, young kids, we went to each other's birthday parties.
Yeah.
I don't remember that. When my family moved to Cleveland after the bus boycott, my dad wanted to become a lawyer. He wanted to be a lawyer actually before my Uncle Fred, but he didn't get to it. He got distracted by my mother.
I
While he was
see.
in college, got married and had a family and had a business and all that, but decided that he and Fred, my Uncle Teddy, were influenced by E.D. Nixon, who said, we are never going to get anywhere unless we can change some laws. We need Black lawyers.
Right.
So my dad decided he was going to do the same thing, had to leave Alabama, uproot his family, go to Cleveland, started out at Western Reserve Law School like my uncle, so he could become a lawyer, and moved back to Alabama and worked with my uncle, who was desegregating everything in town in the state. And
Right.
so that was the plan. But what happened was he finished law school. He could pass the bar in Ohio. Some kind of way he could never pass the bar in Alabama. So he ended up staying in Ohio and practicing civil rights law in Ohio and fair housing and poverty law. And so, I like to say, segregation did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line. There was redlining and all that going on up north. So Uncle Teddy was desegregating the South, and my uncle and my father was desegregating the North. And I think lost track of where we were heading with this conversation.
No, that's great, because you're absolutely right. There was so much, it was the racism in the North was so much more subtle.
Yes.
But nonetheless dangerous. And so it's good you had that two-pronged approach in your family. You hit it from the North and from the South.
We were talking about Dr. King and stories. Dr. King came to Cleveland on various occasions. And he always traveled with his first lieutenant, Reverend Ralph Abernathy.
Right.
And I remember my dad taking us to a church where he was speaking, and King and Abernathy acknowledged my parents at the church, and I thought that was kind of exciting, because I was young, but it was kind of a thrill to see that happening.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And then
you talked about your uncle's involvement with Claudette Colvin, and that she was his first civil rights client.
correct.
I love that story. But then recently they made some history togeter. Can
They
you tell us
did.
about that?
It was in the fall, in October. The Montgomery has an African American mayor for the first time, Stephen Reed. And Stephen Reed wanted to figure out a way to honor my uncle for all these incredible things that he's done for the city and the state. And my uncle said, well, here's, I guess the mayor was saying, do you want a building named after you? What do you want? And my uncle said, well, you could name the street I grew up on after me. Okay, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty simple thing to do. However, the street was named after a Confederate president.
Oh my.
Jefferson Davis. So the mayor said, okay. And so he was going to going through the motions of how you're going to do that. And then the only problem is there is a recent state law that says that you cannot, desecrate or destroy these memorials. There's a $25,000 fine for doing so. So the mayor's like, I don't care. We're going to move forward with this. And they actually changed the name of the street to Fred D. Gray Avenue. So my husband and I went down. They had a big whoop-de-doo, big ceremony out on this, on the street, and unveiled the name of the street, and it was all exciting. So what about the $25,000 fine? Well, a lot of people, even when it first became obvious that it might be a problem, people apparently around the country were volunteering to throw the money at the city so that they could pay the fine. And I called the mayor's. I got in touch with the mayor's office recently to say, well, what's going to happen? And they said the attorney general has sent them a letter. He's going to fine the city. Really? And so apparently the city's going to pay the fine. Okay, so that was that.
It's worth it.
Yeah, $25,000. Yeah, it was worth it.
Absolutely.
Claudette is in the news because that same day, she and my uncle and a lot of other people went over to a family court in Montgomery so that Claudette could petition to clear her record. Because from all these years, she's had this record on the books of being a juvenile delinquent who was convicted of assault against a police officer. So and I think we had pictures of that, where she's in a wheelchair now. She's 82 years old. And she went to the courthouse with her. She has a new lawyer now, and with Fred Gray and the mayor. Oh, everybody went, and she filed the paperwork, and they had a news conference outside after. And she is no longer, well, long story short, an African-American judge in the family court has cleared her record. So at 82 years old, Claudette Colvin is no longer a juvenile delinquent.
It is unfortunate it took so long, but thank goodness they've done it now.
Correct. Yeah. So it's sort of like all those events have come full circle. It's been, 65 years, and here we are. And, some of those same issues are still up in our face. Voter suppression. My father, after that protest after Hilliard Brooks was killed, had a veterans protest against it. And so while they were marching downtown, they carried these signs that said ballots will beat bullets. And they had, it was at a time when a lot of Black people were not registered to vote. They had the people go into the courthouse where you could register, and a bunch of Black people registered to vote. And I looked up some newspaper articles after that. I found one that said that they didn't really mention the protest and what it was about, but they just wondered out loud, I guess the clerk who was in it, why it was that day that so many Black people came in and registered to vote. And Rosa Parks, well, we had poll taxes, and, there were all kinds of things that discouraged voting, literacy tests. Rosa Parks took 3 tries at registering before she could, get the right to register to vote. So, and here we are again. And, all this stuff it's coming back to haunt us. And it just it just speaks to how ingrained racism is in the society.
So, Karen, how did you come up with the title of your book, Daughter of the Movement?
Daughter of the Boycott. Daughter of the Boycott. When I started doing the research, I took some writing workshops. I took some classes because I thought, I'm a journalist. I could just, go out and do some interviews and write this book. And clearly that was not the way it works. So I took some writing workshops. And I had one instructor was Will Haygood, who, I don't know if you saw the movie, The Butler. He wrote the book. Oh. But he was telling, and I learned a lot from him. And he said, keep a running list of titles of your book, So one of mine at the top of the list was to destroy everything segregated, because that was the mission my uncle was on. And so one day I was having lunch with some girlfriends, some of my friends who, I used to work with at Channel 5 in DC. We were sitting around. It was me and Lark McCarthy used to be one of the anchors, and Jan Smith and Cynthia Steele Vance. And we're sort of sitting around, having a glass of wine, talking about, and they always look, where are you with the book? What are you doing now? What are you going to call it? And I said, well, I have a long list of titles, but one of them is To Destroy Everything Segregated. And they thought about it and they said, it might have been his mission, but on your book, it might seem a little too angry. And so Lark said, yeah. And plus, and it's also biographical because that's your uncle's story. You need to claim your own story. So why don't you call it Daughter of the Boycott? And I thought, that it has a nice ring to it. So my friend Lark McCarthy named my book.
Oh, wonderful. Daughter of the Boycott. Sounds good. So, Karen, as we wrap up, is there anything else that you would like to share with us?
I'm going to say that this book is, it's a collection of narratives of things I wanted to learn about the boycott that I did not know. And it highlights stories of some unsung heroes and heroines. And I learned their stories by a little bit from joining some civic groups when I went to Montgomery. And one Montgomery was the name of one of them, Friendly Supper Club, the couple of groups that got together, born from some racial strife that happened in the 80s. And I went to them and I said, I'm working on this book and I need to know about what was going on, during the bus boycott. Who can help me? And at a breakfast meeting at one Montgomery, a woman who was sitting at my table said, I can help you. My father was Clyde Sellers. Well, he was the racist police commissioner during the bus boycott. So that was great. I met one of the speakers at one of the breakfast meetings was Tom Clifford was the executive editor of the local newspaper, The Advertiser. And he invited me to write some columns, in an op-ed that they have called Alabama Voices. He says, you're a native of Alabama. So I started writing about race and, things that I learned a lot of things that way. It was just an incredible experience, just a journey, a learning journey. And I take the reader on that journey with me in the book.
Well, I think there is so much that we can learn from your book, to read about these personal stories and to really understand what life was like then and how we went about changing it. And I think that's the lesson that, I would love to have young people be able to read your book so that they can learn what are those steps that you need to take? What are the things that we need to do to resist the kind of discrimination that we have today?
And to show people how committed some folks were. I got to just throw this in. One couple, Reverend Bob and Jeannie Gratz, a white couple, were active in the boycott. Bob was on the Montgomery Improvement Association board with my dad. They were very active. He drove a car and picked up black passengers, this white guy, right, to keep them off the buses. Right. And the Ku Klux Klan bombed their parsonage on more than one occasion. So it's, when people are asking where they should go and what they should do, I mean, I'm glad to see Black Lives Matter activists as diverse as they are. And, just to say, take a look at history to see how committed some people have been. And there are lessons there.
Absolutely. Much to learn. Karen, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. It's always great talking to you. And
thank you.
So much to learn from you. I hope everyone will go out and get Daughter of the Boycott so that you can learn more about this important part of our history.